The Pilgrims were preparing to have their first Thanksgiving feast. They had chosen the men who would hunt the wildfowl, and they had assigned tasks to others, but something was missing. Who would they invite to this feast? We'll find out in Chapter 8, Invitations and Preparation, Part 2 of the Mayflower story. Now we've come to the place where everyone is getting ready for the big feast, but nobody's quite sure what to do or when it will be ready, and there are several reasons for that. But before we get into it, don't forget to hit the like button if you haven't already. It really helps us reach more history lovers like you. Also, stick around until the end of the video if you can. We have some exciting news to share with you. So let us go back to the Pilgrims and see how they handled all of these invitations and preparations for the Thanksgiving feast. The Pilgrim men had decided that they needed to invite the local Native Americans to their feast. After all, they had helped them survive, and they needed their friendship to continue to thrive in this new land. Plus, Thanksgiving was a religious holiday, and so sharing it with those who had helped them was a sign of gratitude for God as blessings. Now, inviting someone to your house was very important in Pilgrim culture. They would never just show up at someone's door without an invitation. In fact, even after they had established their friendship with the Wampanoag, the Pilgrims still considered them quite savage. However, since they knew that the Wampanoag people had helped them, they wanted to be respectful and hospitable towards them. So Edward Winslow was given the important task of extending the invitation to Massasoit, the chief of the Wampanoag Confederacy. Winslow traveled by canoe up the Charles River to meet with Massasoit, and when he asked for an audience with the chief, a young man named Tisquantum stepped forward. He took Winslow to a council of about 90 Wampanoag men. At first, the Wampanoag were suspicious of the Pilgrims. After all, they had heard stories of the Mayflower and the strange people who had come off of it. But Tisquantum assured them that the Pilgrims meant them no harm, and that they only wished to be friends. And because of Tisquantum's assurance, the Wampanoag agreed to meet with the Pilgrims. When Winslow extended the invitation, Massasoit accepted it with one condition. He said that his men would arrive 3 days later, and he wanted the Pilgrims to prepare a great feast for them. Now, the Pilgrims were honored that the Wampanoag chief and his warriors had accepted their invitation. They knew that this was an important opportunity to build goodwill between the two cultures, so they worked hard to make sure that everything was perfect for their guests. But it wasn't easy. The Pilgrims had never hosted a feast like this before, and they weren't sure how to prepare for such a large group of people. Luckily, they had some help. The Wampano arrived just as promised, and with them, they brought a huge amount of venison, which was very important to them. Venison was a staple of the Wampanoag diet, and they often hunted deer for their meat. In fact, deer were so important to the Wampanoag that they even had a special ceremony for thanking the deer for giving its life so that the people could eat. In addition to the venison, the Wampanoag also brought other provisions, such as fish and corn. This was very helpful for the Pilgrims, as they were running low on food. The Pilgrims had been struggling to grow crops in the New World, and their supplies from England were running out. But with the help of the Wampanoag, they were able to put together a feast that would impress even the most discerning guest. The Wampanoag were very generous with their food, and they shared it freely with the Pilgrims. They also brought with them a young man who was skilled in hunting and fishing. His name was Tisquantum, and he became known as the man who taught the Pilgrims how to survive in the New World. Tisquantum taught the Pilgrims how to catch fish with nets and how to hunt wild fowl with bows and arrows. He also showed them how to gather food from the forest, such as berries and nuts. This was very important, as the Pilgrims were not used to foraging for food. They had relied on their supplies from England, but those were now running out. Tisquantum's help saved the Pilgrims from starvation and helped them to understand how to live off the land. As the Wampanoag prepared the meat for cooking, the Pilgrim women went into the forest to gather berries and nuts. They had seen the Wampanoag women doing this and knew that it was an important part of their culture. The women gathered blackberries, raspberries, and chestnuts, which they would use to make desserts for the feast. Meanwhile, the Pilgrim men were busy building a roasting pit. This was an important part of the preparation process, as it allowed them to cook the venison over a low heat for several hours. This would ensure that the meat was tender and juicy. On the second day, the Pilgrim men set out to catch wild fowl. They had seen the Wampanoag men using bows and arrows to hunt birds, and they knew that this was an important source of protein for their guests. The men were successful in their hunt and returned to the village with several wild turkeys, ducks, and geese. These birds would be roasted and served with the venison at the feast. On the third day, the men finished the roasting pit and the Wampanoag arrived with their feast. The Pilgrims were impressed by the amount of food that the Wampanoag had brought, and they knew that they had to do everything they could to make their guests feel welcome. As the Wampanoag set up their tents, the Pilgrim children were curious and excited. They had never seen so much activity in their little village, and they wanted to know more about their guests. Edward Winslow's wife, Rose, was in charge of welcoming the Wampanoag women and children. She gave them presents and showed them around the village. The Wampanoag women were impressed by the Pilgrims' hospitality, and they knew that they were in good hands. By the time the feast was ready, both the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag had a lot of food to share. The Pilgrims had roasted the venison in the pit, and it smelled delicious. They had also baked bread in their ovens, and it was golden and inviting. The Wampanoag had prepared their own dishes, and they had brought corn and fish to share. When all the food was laid out on tables, it was a feast fit for a king. There were platters of roasted venison, loaves of bread, bowls of corn, and baskets of fish. The Pilgrims and the Wampanoag gathered around the tables and gave thanks for the bounty before them. After the prayer, the feasting began. The Pilgrims and the Wampanoag ate together, sharing stories and laughter. The children played while the adults talked, and everyone enjoyed the delicious food. The feast lasted for 3 days, and during that time, the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag learned a lot about each other. They shared stories about their cultures, and they also learned about each other's food. The Wampanoag were impressed by the Pilgrim-'s bread, and the Pilgrims were amazed at the Wampanoag's corn dishes. By the end of the feast, both groups had formed a bond that would last for years. And that's where we'll leave off for today. If you'd like to learn more about the Mayflower story, check out the series in the description below. Thanks for watching. And if you want to join us for Chapter 9, click the link on screen now.